Hi, this is James, and I'd like to welcome you to this viewer-requested video. This video comes on the heels of a lovely email that I got from a viewer. Her name is Madeline. So Madeline, if you're watching this video, hello, and this is for you. In the email, Madeline told me that she found my very first Lenormand Grand Tableau video, and in that video I explained my process for reading a Grand Tableau. So I want to applaud and acknowledge Madeline and anybody else who may be here who's watched that video, because that is my longest running video in terms of time on my channel. So it clocks in, I want to say, at least 65 to 70 minutes. So that to me is a huge investment of your time. So again, those of you who've watched it, I want to thank you for giving me that gift of your time. So Madeline asked me after watching that video if I would be posting any more Lenormand Grand Tableau videos, as well as would I consider the idea of possible Lenormand mentoring. So at that point, when she mentioned that, I hadn't given it any thought, because I still consider myself relatively new to Lenormand. I don't consider myself an authority or an expert in any means. I'm just a guy who's very enthusiastic about it and just likes sharing his process when people inquire about it. So that's how I view my experience with Lenormand so far. So the video that you're about to see, I used that question to explore the idea of Lenormand mentoring, but also too, around the same time that I got that email from Madeline, a tarot group that I had been a part of for almost as long as I've been reading tarot. I have been reading tarot for 18 years, and other divination systems have come up in the course of that span. But I've been reading tarot all throughout my 18 years as being a card reader. And in December of last year, at the end of last year, the group came to a close. And so it folded, and I was left with wondering, well, where do I go from here? Because that was a huge chunk of my life and a huge chunk of my tarot journey. And I'm a big believer that when a door closes, the universe opens a window, but I just didn't know what that window was going to be or the form it was going to take when it showed up. So I'm asking the question about my path as a card reader, but with also the undercurrent of Madeline's suggestion of possible Lenormand mentoring. So now that I've set the reading up, let's shift gears and get to the table and take a closer look at the cards that I threw for this particular Grand Tableau. And here we are with the cards that have made up the tableau. The deck that I'm using for the reading is the Dondorf Lenormand. This particular deck is a reproduction of the Dondorf Lenormand, and I found it in this book and deck set. It is the Easy Lenormand. It is by Marcus Katz and Tali Goodwin, and it is published by Llewellyn. I also know that you can find this deck. It's also known as the French Cartomancy deck, and that is published by Lo Scarabeo. So if you like this deck, those are two ways that you can find it and acquire it. So again, just to kind of touch on the context for the Grand Tableau, in December of last year, a tarot group that I had been associated with most of my tarot journey came to a close. The group ended, it folded, and it kind of set the stage for me to start questioning about my path as a card reader. And then shortly after that, I received an email from Madeline, who had asked me about the possibility of Lenormand mentoring. Like, have I done that? Would I be open to the idea? That kind of thing. So that gave me food for thought, and it kind of propelled, those two things kind of propelled me into doing a Grand Tableau about moving forward as a card reader. And so what I do in my card readings, I tend to look at where the placement of my significator card is. So going with the gentleman card, looking for that, I found the gentleman here in the top row, and the gentleman is in the house of the house. So for me, That was significant because for me, the house can represent like having a foundation laid. So it talks about my foundation as a card reader in light of the fact that I'm asking the question about where do I go from here. So I noted that. And the house is also a card of comfort. So in the space, I'm occupying the space of being comfortable as a card reader. For me, reading cards, it's like being at home. Reading cards feels like home to me. So I love the fact that the gentleman is occupying that space. The other thing about the house card for me, and this is relative to me, is that I work from home. So I actually read cards from home. I actually have a space in my house that's dedicated for having clients come to the house, and we have our card reading sessions here. So I noted that as well. So then what I did was I noticed that book was right next to the gentleman card. So here, book can be, in addition to having knowledge about, teaching and learning and education, I look at book as cards and decks of cards and being a card reader, because just like reading a book, cards are read. So here it describes me as being a card reader, so I love that. In addition to that, book is in the house of the ship. And so ship for me can represent progression, advancement, and moving forward. And again, that's just another way that the cards are keeping in context with the question, because I asked the question about like my path and direction. So basically it's saying to like, where do we go from here in terms of being a card reader? So I like that. So that jumped out at me in the moment. Then what I did was, once I find where my card is, I looked to see what card is occupying my house. So what I did was I looked for the card that was in the house of the gentleman, and here we have the coffin. So now the coffin is a card for me that can represent endings, it can represent completions, it can represent closure, something being final or finalized. So when I first looked at that, it struck me, the connection that I made to it was about the group coming to an end, and and maybe the idea of mourning that, because the group had been such an important part of my life, an important chapter of my life for a long part of my life. Most of the 18 years I've been reading cards, I was part of this group. So that was a big deal. So I think the cards were highlighting how important that was, or how significant that was to me, since the coffin's in my house. And then I noticed that looking for the card that represents direction or the path would be literally the path or the ways or the crossroads. So what I did was I found it here in the house of the child. So I loved it that it came right on the heels of coffin being in the house of the gentleman, because in the house of the child it represents something new, something beginning, something that's starting up. So it could be like a departure, because I tend to look at crossroads or ways or path as a departure, but also too about path and direction. So it's about a departure that kind of set the stage for a new beginning or moving into a new direction, that kind of thing. So I loved how that speaks to the nature of the question as well. Then I noticed I jumped over 2 cards because stars at the end of this particular row caught my eye because it's in its own house. So then what I did was I stepped back and I quickly looked to see if there were other cards in their own houses, and stars is the only card in its own house. So a card that's in its own house for me kind of strengthens the meaning of that particular card. So stars for me can represent guidance, direction, could represent inspiration and aspiration. But keeping in with the context of the question, I love the fact that it's being magnified. So it's saying too, like, the cards are highlighting the importance of the question about my guidance, about clarity, about direction moving forward. The other thing that struck me with stars for me is a card that can represent divination. And so I love the fact, again, it's keeping in context with the question, the importance of the question to me. And the other thing here, and this would be putting in the slant with Madeline and the Lenormand mentoring, is that I tend to read stars as coaching, because I am a life coach as well as a card reader. I have been trained as a life coach. So for me, it could be like the idea about coaching people or guiding people or offering people direction either through the cards or about the cards. So that could be something that would be significant down the line, because this is, if we go here, like this is my present, this is moving towards the future, and this is here at the end of the tableau. So this would be somewhere maybe down the line. So I noted that. And then another card that caught my eye would be ship, going with the idea of ship being about a journey, you know, going with the idea of this is path, and that's path and direction, then ship would be about the overall journey. So I looked to see where ship was, and ship is in the house of the moon. So for me, the moon is the space about our career. It's about recognition, what you're being recognized for, what you have a reputation for, and also to what you may be honored for. So those are some aspects of the moon. In this particular case, keeping in context with the question, I went with the idea that moon could be about one's vocation. And I came into this work as a result of having a dream about reading playing cards. Now, prior to that, I had never used playing cards in my waking life to do fortune telling. And that dream set the stage for tarot being brought into my life, because the dream dictionary I had, isn't that interesting, book behind the man. So the dream dictionary I had at the time, when I looked up playing cards, it specifically said that playing cards were directly related to tarot, and that's how I got into tarot, because I had no other frame of reference for it. So that sets a stage for me to become a tarot reader. So again, I'm seeing that the progression of my vocation. I tend to look at, because it came to me in a dream, that kind of spirit, the universe, if you will, going with the stars being the universe, kind of set me on this path, because it brought that to my subconscious awareness. And then that would be a nod back to coffin, because coffin can represent, if you go with the idea coffin can represent rest and sleep, well, dreams are activities that take place when we are unconscious, you know, we're not consciously awake, and it's subconscious material. So I noted that. And so now what we'll do is we'll take a look at the first three cards, because that's the next step in my Grand Tableau process. And so now taking a look at the first three cards, because for me, the first three cards can represent the information that's prompting the reading. It could be shedding light in that sense. It could be also general advice. So going with that, we have bear, we have dog, and we have book. So what I do is, when I look at the first three cards, I tend to pair them up in different ways and then create some form of summation. So going with that, what I did was I first paired bear and dog. And in this particular context, I looked at bear as resource, because I tend to look at bear as resources. One of my keywords for bear is resources. And then going with that, then I tend to look at dog as something that is helpful or something that is supportive. So the pairing here could be a helpful resource. And then what I did was I looked at dog and book. That was my next pairing. And here I had a few more options. So for me, the dog can represent friendship and companionship. So going with the idea that book represents the cards themselves, one possibility here is, you know, a friendship with the cards. I tend to look at dog as loyalty, so that could be also loyalty to the cards, because I've been reading cards for 18 years now. So that requires some sense of loyalty. And with that, I tend to look at dog as also something that's trustworthy. So it's about having trust in the cards as well. I mean, if you're going to read cards and get information or guidance from the cards, or even advice, because I tend to look at dog as an advisor. So, you know, advice, if you're going to get advice from the cards, then to some degree, you have to have trust in the cards and the messages that they're going to provide. So, and I have a great deal of trust in the cards. So the other thing could be about help, support, and advice, because I mentioned advice already, from the cards. So those are some possibilities. And then I considered, if we go with the idea that dog is a companion, then the pairing of dog and book could be a companion to the cards. And so it's very interesting. The deck that I'm using for this particular reading is a deck and book set, right? So with that, the book is considered the companion to the cards, right? So it could be something like that. It could be a resource that's going to be helpful, and it comes in the form of a companion to a card deck or a card system. So those are some possibilities with those. And then what I did was I mirrored, and mirroring is where you take the cards that bookend the middle card and looked at those as a pair. And so for me, bear, in addition to resource, can represent somebody who is an authority. I go with that because bear can represent, for me, somebody who's a boss, somebody who's a manager, somebody who's a leader, and with all of that has some level of authority. So going with that, then book becomes knowledge. And so for me, the pairing can represent a knowledgeable authority. Bear can also be about power and strength. So for me, there's power in the cards, or the power of the cards. And then I considered, if we go with the idea that book is about teaching and learning, then it could be either a teaching resource or a learning resource, going with the idea that book is about education. And then for me, I have been reading cards, like I said, 18 years now, and it just amazes me about the power that the cards have. So for me, it's book in this particular case. If I go with the idea that bear is about power, then book can be about something that's a mystery or something that's mysterious. So the cards having a kind of a mysterious power. It's like, how do they do what they do? Especially keeping in context with how relevant the cards and the card placement is in context to the question. And you could tell yourself, well, that's random, but is it? Just something to think about. So, you know, and it doesn't matter how often I do this. When those moments happen, when I'm having that kind of like, ooh, you know, like that ooh moment, like that sense of awe and wonder, you know, there has to be something to that, something more. So some possibilities for the entire line. Once I do that kind of pairing to kind of create some combinations that may be helpful in coming with an overall summation, a couple of things I came up with is a strong and powerful ally in the cards. If you go with the idea that bear is strong and powerful, dog is ally, and then book is cards. Then another possibility I got in the moment was a resource that is helpful in reading and studying the cards. So that would be a resource that is helpful in reading and studying the cards. So there's that. So that could be general information, and again, that could be something that's coming in. If we go with the idea that bear is in the house of the writer always represents, in addition to news and messages, but it's like the arrival of something, like what's coming in. So that is how I read the first three cards, and so now we'll look at the corners, because that's my next go-to when I'm doing my own tableaus. And so now taking a look at the corners, the way I read the corners is I take the card in house 1 and I pair it with the card in house 32, and then I take a look at the card in house 8 and I pair it with the card in house 25. So going with that, bear and ship form a pair, and I looked at that as a foreign or overseas authority, going with the idea what I said when I looked at the first three cards about bear possibly being an authority figure. Then this would describe the authority figure, somebody who is overseas or abroad. You know, it could also be too, if I go with the idea about a resource, then bear and ship could be a resource that's designed to help me progress or move forward or advance. Then the other pairing is fox and moon. So the interesting thing here is that fox for me is a card that can represent skill. So keeping in context with the question, it's talking about my skill as a card reader. But the other aspect of fox is it can represent employment or self-employment. And so I am self-employed. So I loved how that part of the my situation kind of is being reflected in the cards. And so Fox being skill and job and employment. And then here we have Moon on the other side. And so Moon is like career. So we have the one aspect of our working life, which is a job or employment. And then we have Moon, which is the idea of like a career. So like here we like, is what I'm doing, is it a job or is it a career? It could be a job or a skill that has become a career. Keeping in line that for me, because I've been doing it for so long, that, you know, the longer you do it, chances are it's not just a job, it becomes a career. So I tend to look at Fox and Moon in that regard. It could also be, too, a skill that's being honored or recognized, or a skill that I have a reputation for. And that would be, out of all the divination systems that I work with, that's probably talking about tarot, because I've been working with tarot the longest. And more often than not, when people book a session with me, it's usually having a tarot reading done. So I noted that with Fox and Moon. And so that is quickly how I look at the corners. And so now what I'll do is I'm going to take a look at the cards that are boxing my significator card. And so now taking a look at the cards that are boxing my significator card. So again, my card being the gentleman. Here, typically I would be looking for 9 cards to or 8 cards rather, but I would be looking for a reading of 9 cards to do this particular reading. But being what it is, there's no cards above my card or the book or the bouquet. So what I did was I just took a look at these 6 cards. So the interesting thing that I noted was, when I'm doing a box, I tend to look at the first card in the box, and that is like the opening, just like Bear was the opening when we looked at the first 3 cards. So now Book is the opening card here. Again, strong connection to the context of the question being about card reading. And then the interesting thing here is that the exit card, if this is the opening card, this is the exit card in the box. And that's the path or the ways or the crossroads. And again, that also is in context to the question, because it's about path, it's about direction, it's about like where do we go from here, that kind of thing. So it's very interesting how just looking at this part actually plays into the context of the question so well. So what I do in this particular context, what I did was I paired Book and Ways, because now they become a pairing. And so keeping with the idea here about the question about Lenormand mentoring by Madeline, the pairing here could be like teaching is being decided upon, because he's facing this way. So these are the cards that are in the future, these are the cards that are the past, and this is the present, right? So this would be teaching is being decided upon. So it means that in this space and time, I haven't reached a decision about that. The other thing that I like about this pairing is that Ways can represent something that's multiples. So it could be the idea here about having multiple decks, and at this particular time, if I consider all the deck systems I have in my house at this moment in time, I have at least 250 decks. That's a combination of tarot, angel cards, oracle cards, Lenormand, Kipper, and playing cards. So all of those systems, take those into account, I have at least 250. So I love the fact that it's talking about those. Now the other thing here that could be being highlighted with the idea about direction and where do we go from here, it could be alternatives to reading. You know, so in addition to being a card reader, there could be something that's going to be presented to me that's going to maybe put me off in a new direction or start something new, or that I'm going to be doing in addition to the card reading, because right now that's all I pretty much do. And so the interesting thing was the next corner cards, if I paired them, kind of give some idea of what that might be. So Bouquet is the first corner card, and Bouquet can represent a gift, it can represent an invitation, it could represent a surprise, it could also represent some form of appreciation. And what I like about this is that the gentleman is facing the bouquet. So it could be, this is saying like that's something he's going to be receiving, or something I'm going to be receiving because he is me. So something that I'm going to be receiving. So it could be I'm going to be receiving a gift. I'm going to be receiving a surprise. It could be I'm going to be receiving, excuse me, some form of appreciation. So keeping that in mind. So it could also be too, if I mirror, because this just came to me in the moment. I don't think this is in my notes, but this came to me in the moment, that I'm in the middle of book and bouquet. So it could be like talking about the man. He has a reading gift, or that he's a talented reader, or that his talent for reading is being appreciated. You know, those are some possibilities that are just coming out to me in the moment. So I put that out there. Okay, but back to bouquet, and then the other corner card is birds. So birds for me represents communication, and it usually represents verbal communication. So going with that, the possibility here, it could be like an invitation to speak. So it could be like one of the other possibilities in addition to reading cards could be I could be asked to speak about different aspects of card reading or different types of systems or something of that nature. So that's a possibility that I saw with bouquet and birds. And the other one, since I talked about appreciation, it could be like appreciation in words. You know, like people who have very complimentary things to say, very nice things to say, things of that nature, you know, and those always warm my heart. Those always mean so much to me. But it could be suggesting like there may be more of that to come. So that was how I looked at the corners in the box. And so another possibility here would be to look at the card here that I didn't touch on yet, and that's a tower. And my card is above the tower. So for me, going with the idea that the gentleman in the house of the house, I talked about the foundation being laid. For me, when a card is, or a significator card is above another card, it represents like standing on that, you know. So that becomes your foundation. And so tower, in this particular context, can represent a couple of things. The first thing, it struck me as the idea about standing on tradition. So in any card system, at least in my approach to it, you know, when I got into it, I wanted to learn about some of the traditions, not all of them, and, you know, not from a historical context. It's that, you know, the history of it, to some degree, doesn't mean that much to me in terms of, like, because a lot of divination systems, the history is really unknown. You know, people throw ideas and theories about, like, well, this was developed here, this, or this came out of this, or, you know, but it's speculation. Nobody really knows. And going with the idea, I just touched on the idea about birds. Birds can be speculation. So there's a lot of speculation about traditions. And so I don't really buy into that. What I do is I buy into the foundational traditions of how to read and how to work with the cards. I'm not so keen on the history because, like I said, a lot of the history is speculation. But I'm really keen on having a sense of what is the tradition. So no matter what the system is, like, what's the traditions of the system? It's about, like, you work with the tradition to form a foundation, and then what happens is you get creative, because bouquet can be about creativity. You get creative and you kind of play with that. And then that's what you do in making how you read unique to you. It's like, but you learn the foundation, you learn the basics, and then you use the basics as a launching off point to kind of come up with your own thing and be really creative in your process. Now, the other thing about tower, and again, this is the foundation because it's, you know, it's what I'm rooted in. Tower can represent working or doing something by yourself, you know, because it represents isolation, withdrawal, you know, solitary activity. So for me, it represents, when I started with tarot in particular, because that was the first system, when I started with tarot and eventually moved into the other ones, I worked by myself. Or, you know, at the beginning, I thought it was going to be something that I just did for myself. And what happened was, one day, the universe sent somebody my way that asked me the question, how much do you charge for a reading? And that's really how my business was created. it was created because someone asked me the question. At that time, I had been reading for myself, but you know how it is about news travels fast, or news gets around, going with the birds, you know, people talking. So people talked, and that's how I got into, you know, doing it for other people, and then, you know, doing it as a form of business. But that's how I started. I started reading the cards for myself. So the idea here that you can't read the cards for yourself, you know, I'm a big believer in that's not true. At least in my particular case, that wasn't true. I think the challenge with reading for yourself is that you have to have some form of detachment. You know, you can't, the more emotionally connected, or the more emotionally you are invested in the situation that you're using the cards to look at, chances are you're not going to see things clearly, and you're not going to be objective. And so for some reason, you know, that dream was I was reading my own cards. So the dream set it up where that wasn't going to be too much of a challenge for me, and that turned out to be the case. For me, it's more about learning the structure, learning the system, learning the traditions of the system, things of that nature. But I'm primarily self-taught, so I'm finding that in the cards, like standing on that. So those were the things that jumped out at me with the box. But then I started thinking about the idea of, you know, talking to groups. And so who would I talk to? So what I did was I looked for the card that was in the house of the garden, because a garden for me can represent audience. So in this particular case, the key is in the house of the garden. So for me, it would be saying to, like, if I am going to be invited to speak, that audience is key. You know, so the audience is important. You know, you can't talk to an empty room. So it'd be about, like, who would be the key audience or the key demographic for me, both in terms of my card reading and in terms of, like, if I'm being asked to speak about the cards. I noticed that the woman or the lady card was facing the key. So it was saying too, like, women's groups are important, because going with the idea that key is in the house of the garden. Garden can represent groups or communities, and then the woman or the lady card would be describing those communities. So it would be women's groups, communities of women. Because women tend to be more into divination than men. Yes, we have a lot of men who are into divination, case in point. But in terms of, like, audience, more women typically, generally speaking, are into divination. So it would be like, you know, so I saw that. And then also too, here would be, I looked for the garden card, and the garden card is right here in the house of the sun. So again, it's clarifying groups of people, or clarifying an audience. And so that would be significant and important. So this is saying too, like, yes, there would be success with that, you know, or, you know, confidence in that, because I tend to look at the sun as about success, confidence, positive energy, but also something that's being illuminated. So it could be, you know, other people becoming illuminated because they're in that space of, you know, seeking clarity about how to read the cards. Like in Madeline's case, you know, I tend to draw people who are new to reading cards, and so it's about their seeking guidance and direction about the cards. They're looking for clarity. You know, they're looking to become successful in their card reading efforts, whether they're doing it for themselves or they're doing it professionally. But also too, they're wanting to build their confidence up, because this is, like I said, gardens in the space of the sun, and the sun can be about confidence. So those were some of the things that stood out to me when I looked at boxing the significator. And so now what we'll do is we'll do some knighting to see what else the cards can say about me in relation to my question. So now doing some knighting, and knighting is a way for me to kind of look at some more elements or some more ways to describe the person, in this particular case me, in context to the situation. So knighting is a process where you can go just like knighting on a chessboard. So what I do is I go over, either over 1 and down 2, or over 2 and down 1. So when I did that, the first thing that struck me, I went over 2 and down 1. And so here, my card knights the clouds. So in context with the question about asking about my path and direction about moving forward, at this time, clouds is saying there is a sense of uncertainty about that, where we're going. So because clouds for me represents confusion, uncertainty, being unsure, that kind of energy. Now, in terms of the Lenormand mentoring that Madeline had suggested, there could be some sense of uncertainty, or based on my level of experience, because I don't really consider myself to be an authority on the subject, I just share these from my own personal experience with the cards. But with that, it could be like I have doubt about that prospect because I don't consider myself to be an authority on the subject, right? So there's that possibility with clouds and gentlemen. Now, I went the other way. I went over 2 and down 1, and then my card also knights the scythe. And so the scythe, just like the clouds, can be a bit of a challenging card. So in this context, I considered the scythe to represent something unexpected. So the pairing could represent like me facing something unexpected. So it could be like in this space of wanting some clarity, it could be like something comes my way unexpectedly to kind of help make things clear. Now, in terms of being a card reader, then the scythe for me can represent sharpening one's skill. If you go with the idea that a scythe is a sharp tool, then for me it represents like sharpening my skills, becoming more precise or accurate, because the scythe can be about precision. So that's how I looked at that. And then what I did was I went over 1 and down 2. So I connect or knight with the lady. So again, reinforcing the idea that there may be a connection. And here's the thing too, in addition to knighting the woman, if we kind of see where they intersect or meet at the book. So it could be a woman who's also reading, or a woman who's also studying the cards, or something of that nature, who may be very important. Or it could be some prior knowledge that I have, because book being behind me represents knowledge that I've already acquired, right? So it could be some knowledge that I've already acquired that's going to be helpful to a woman, because this is the key in this context is about discovery. So she discovers something, or she finds the answer or solution, or something is revealed to her. So there could be that, but it could also be too like she's an important woman to me. So somehow I'm going to be connected to a woman who's going to be very important. So those are 2 ways to look at that. So then what I did was I went the other way, and I went over 1, down 2. And then the last card my card can knight to is the fish. So here we have a card that can represent the entrepreneur. So it describes me, again, going with the idea that I work from home, that I'm self-employed as this card reader, and then I make money doing that. So that was my first go-to with that. It could also be too like I could be receiving money, because even though I'm knighting, then this card would be in the future. So it could be receiving money. So and now that I'm saying that, which would be a surprise, possibly because I'm mirroring, this just jumped out at me in the moment, so I'm mirroring that. So it could be receiving money. That comes as a surprise. So those were some of the things that came to me as a result of knighting. And so now what we'll do is we'll take a look at how I rounded out this reading. And this is just initially, I didn't really go into all aspects of the reading hardcore. There's lots of other processes I could have done that I would normally do, but this is just like things that just came to me in the moment, really, really quickly. And so the last thing I'm going to touch on is the last 4 cards in the tableau, which is the essence line. And so now taking a look at the essence line, for me, these 4 cards can represent, after you've looked at all aspects of the tableau that you want to look at, because like I said, there's lots of techniques that are optional. There are lots of things you can do with the tableau that you don't have to do. But they're designed to kind of help repeat or reinforce messages. So it's kind of good to know some of those things, and then you could decide, well, that's really complicated, or, that really doesn't work for me. And the idea here is about like trying things out, again, going with the tradition or the system, trying things out, and then deciding after you've tried it, deciding after whether that particular technique or process works for you. So for me, the essence line is about like punctuating the entire tableau. It could be offering to like final advice. So that's how I look at that. So here we have lilies, we have the child, we have the cross, and we have the stork. So what I do, again, just like I did with the first 3 cards, what I do is I pair them up and kind of read them in pairs, and then kind of come up with an overall summation based on some of those combinations. So going with lilies and child first, for me, lilies in this context can represent a couple of things. For me, it can represent experience, because I tend to look at lilies as wisdom gained through experience. But it can also be a person who is an elder or a senior who shares that wisdom with other people. So going with that, I tend to look at lilies as like mentoring. And again, that brings in Madeline's question or suggestion about Lenormand mentoring. So there's that. And I love the fact that the lilies is mentioning that. So when I pair lilies and child, again, child being something that's new, something that's beginning, something that's starting out, it could be a new experience begins, or it could be a mentor for beginners. Again, keeping in mind that most of the people who watch my card reading videos, and I should say I'm being made aware of this in the moment, that a lot of people who have asked for me to do video requests like this have all been around Lenormand, and each of those people have been people who are just starting out. And so, and they kind of were attracted to the way I explain things. So I tend to draw people who are just starting out with the cards. So mentor for beginners. And then I went to child and cross. Some possibilities here. Again, keeping with the idea that child can represent something new, something beginning. Cross for me can represent something that's difficult, something that's burdensome, something that is critical. So going with the idea here, some possibilities were a critical or necessary start. Could be a difficult start. It could be beginner's difficulty. Again, going with the idea that I attract beginners who may be having some difficulty starting out. So there's that. And with that, cross for me has a positive slant to it too, because sometimes cross can be seen as a challenging card. Cross for me can represent one's faith. So it could be, as people are starting out, one of the things that's helpful in terms of advice is about keeping the faith. You know, having faith in your ability to read the cards, keeping faith in your ability to read the cards, that kind of thing. So cross for me is about a need to keep the faith. Then, moving on to cross and stork. You know, stork at the end of the line, this is a great card to have at the end of the line because it represents positive change and improvement. So going with that, pairing cross and stork, some possibilities here are difficulty, changes, or improves. And that faith leads to improvement. So that's how it will look. So for people, my advice based on my own experience, based on past experience, is when you're starting out, 2 things. Number 1, when you're starting out, don't overcomplicate things, because child is about keeping it simple. Keeping it simple from the start. You know, if you're just a beginner, the idea here is from the start, you want to try and make it as simple for you as possible, right? So I'm seeing that. The other piece of advice is when things get difficult or you're experiencing difficulty, it's important that you keep the faith, have faith in your ability, that you're going to move from being a beginner to becoming somebody who's very seasoned, right? And the only way you're going to do that is by making sure that you continue to have experiences with the cards. So I would see that. And then in time, that will change and improve. So that would be how I'm looking at that. And now that would be me offering advice to other people. So it could be, again, you know, going with the context of the question, could be like there's something that's going to be beginning for me, a new beginning, you know, may be difficult at the start, or it's going to be a critical beginning based on my experience and based on where I'm at. But even if the beginning is difficult, it will change and improve. So again, that would be the idea, keeping in context with the path, the direction, you know, where do we go from here, that kind of thing. So it could be saying too, I've acquired some experience that's going to propel me into a new phase. It's going to be difficult possibly at the start, but that will change and improve. But it's critical. This new phase, this new start is critical or necessary to my growth. It's going to add to my overall wisdom gained through experience idea with the lilies. So I'm seeing that as how I would read the essence line. And so on that note, that would bring how I initially looked at the Grand Tableau that I did on the dual question about my path moving forward, you know, as a card reader, and the idea here with the undercurrent or the secondary aspect of the possibility of considering Lenormand mentoring. So I'm James Himm Mitchell. I'm going to wrap things up and bring this to a close here. I hope you have found this helpful. And Madeline, if you watched this, I hope you found it helpful. Madeline, I will say, is very encouraging and very supportive. And she's also asked me to continue doing more Grand Tableau videos. So if you are like Madeline and you find this one of interest and you would like to see more, just let me know. If you have some ideas for situations, concerns, some aspects of a Grand Tableau that you may be having challenge with, that I could possibly shed some more light on based on my own experience, let me know that, and I will always take them into account. In addition to the weekly readings that I do, I'm always wanting to make sure that the content that I put up is something that people actually want to see, something that will be insightful, something that will be informative, and something that will be helpful to them. So I'm a big believer in that. So suggestions are always welcome and always encouraged. So again, I'm James Himm Mitchell, and as I sign off, I'm wishing you a wonderful day, and until we get together in the next video, take care.